Well, I want to begin by thanking you for inviting me to join your meeting, and I want to thank you for choosing this talk as one of the two that I give. This is probably my favorite talk to give, and I hope it will become very appealing to you too. It's a talk about bait hives, as you can see. Well, as you can see in this first slide, that there's a couple of things about this, about using bait hives. One is that it's a good way to get locally adapted bees, and as we'll see, maybe even survivor stock bees. That's what I get with my bait hives. Maybe that will be the case for you folks too. And when I do this, I get some colonies that show the cell uncapping, recapping trait very nicely. So these are often bees that are strongly express the VSH trait. Let's see, Tom, how do we advance here? Down here. Here's an outline of the talk. We're first going to very quickly review the natural nest sites of honeybees, because this is the foundation for knowing what makes a good bait hive, what the bees want. Then we'll review the nest site preferences of honeybees, what they want when they get to choose their homes. We'll look then at an effective bait hive design. You'll see it's very simple. And then we'll discuss briefly how to use bait hives. And then at the very end, I'm going to share with you a little study I did that compared colonies that were headed by commercially produced queens and bait hive caught queens. I think it will compare them particularly in terms of their ability to resist the mites. And survive without treatments. I think you will be amazed, as I was. Well, one slide devoted to the natural nest sites of honeybees. They're quite different from our hives. Their entrances are high off the ground. Their entrances are small, and they live in a modest nest cavity. It's the volume of about one deep hive body. And these traits aren't just by chance. These are the things that the nest site scouts seek in a home site: a high entrance, a small entrance, and a modest sized nest cavity. Okay, so now we'll talk, those are the traits of the natural nests, but now let's look at what the scout bees prefer, what the nest site preferences of honeybees are. And I'll review quickly with you the studies that I learned about this. And the way I did my study of what the bees want in a home site was based on seeing these photos and paintings of beekeepers in Africa that capture swarms by putting up bait hives. In these cases, there's log hives. And I saw those drawings and photos, and I read about them in a magazine called Bee World, and I wondered, maybe we could do that here in North America too. And so in 1975, when I was I guess I was 23 years old, I did a pilot experiment to see if one put up a bait hive, what was the probability of its being occupied? So I went out and made a bunch of green boxes that looked like birdhouses on steroids, basically, put them up on places like power line poles, and did a test run, a pilot test study. And I put up 6 bait hives, and I got 3 out of the 6 were occupied in the summer of 1975. I thought, yippee, that's good. I had no idea. Once I knew that there was a reasonable probability to put up a bait hive or a nest box that bees would move into it, I realized that using these boxes, I could figure out what the bees want in a home. So I built that in December of that year. I got 70 sheets of 5/8 inch plywood, and I built 252 nest boxes. And then in the following summers, 76 and 77, I caught 124 swarms. And it wasn't catching the swarms per se that was important. It was what those swarm captures revealed about the bees' preferences in a home. And the way I did this is I put out the nest boxes in pairs, and I tried to find places where the 2 boxes would be paired in all ways except for the difference between the 2 boxes. And the boxes in a pair were identical in all ways except for one property. It might be the volume of the cavity, the area of the entrance, the height of the entrance, those sorts of things. You can see it was a pretty simple design or test of the bees' home site preferences. And well, what did I find? Well, I found that, I'll explain. To test the bees, see if they had a preference in the cavity volume, I put out nest boxes in groups of 3. And one was a small box, one was a medium box, one was a big box, kind of like Goldilocks, the bears. And I chose these volumes, 10, 40, and 100 liters, because I knew that in nature, a 10-liter cavity was very rare. A 40-liter cavity was quite common. That's typical bee tree cavity size. And 100 liters was, again, very rare. And what I found in this particular test with these trios of bait hives, I found that the only boxes the bees moved into were the 40-liter ones. So that was a pretty clear indication. I won't go through the statistics, but that was a very clear indication. They wanted something about this size. That's too small. This is too big. What about cavity shape preference? Well, I asked them, I was wondering, well, maybe squat versus tall was important to the bees. In nature, the cavities are tall and thin because they're in trees, but maybe that's just because that's the way the cavities form in trees. So I did a test with squat versus tall, and the bees said, no, we really don't care about the cavity shape preference. They moved into the two with equal likelihood. What about entrance size preference? Well, I knew, again, in nature that from the bee trees that their nest entrances are pretty small. It's only about a couple of square inches, much smaller than on our hives. So I put out boxes that had small entrances like they have in bee trees, and larger entrances, larger than I found in bee trees. And what did I find? I found that they only went into the boxes that had small entrances. And I just want to emphasize that every time I put out a pair of boxes, the 2 boxes were the same in all ways except for one trait. So these 2 boxes had the same volume, same height off the ground, same color, same shape. The only difference was the size of the entrance. And it was a night and day. They only moved into the boxes with small entrances. What about entrance shape? Well, I knew from my studies of the bee tree homes that some of them are knot holes, so they're roundish, and some are cracks in trees, so they're slits. And I thought, well, maybe these are easy. These slit ones are easier for the bees to defend, so maybe they would actually prefer those. So I put up boxes with the entrances to those 2 shapes, everything else the same, color, size, blah, blah, blah. And I found no shape preference, entrance shape preference by the bees. What about draftiness? I thought, gosh, these bees, they don't want a drafty home, but I wanted to find out, and so I asked them the question. I made boxes, put up pairs of boxes, and in one box there were lots of holes drilled on the 1/4-inch diameter holes drilled on the front and the sides of the boxes. And the other box, I didn't drill any holes. So it was a difference between drafty and non-drafty. And what did I find? No preference. That the bees are choosy about things they can't fix. They can't change the size of the cavity and so forth, or the height of the entrance, but they can plug little holes. Bees can fill holes with propolis. So this table summarizes what I learned about what the bees preferences are and where they don't have preferences. For example, just to review, what's ever in blue, those are things that the bees show a preference. Cavity volume, they want about 1.5 cubic feet. Not smaller, not a lot bigger. Shape doesn't matter. Dryness doesn't matter. Oh, and I could explain, you can guess the way I did the dryness is I put wet sawdust in the cavity, and you could probably guess that they didn't care about that because they could haul that, they could take out the wet sawdust, and they can waterproof a nest. Draftiness, as we talked about, they plugged the holes. They didn't care about that. Entrance area, that's really important to them. Entrance height is very important to them. Shape of the entrance is not. Position of the entrance, they do prefer strongly the entrance at the bottom of the cavity, and they like the cavity's nest entrance to face south. And these are all, that doesn't surprise us. But it's nice to know that not only do we like them to face south, but the bees like the entrances to face south. And one last variable, they really, really, really are attracted to a cavity if it's already furnished with combs. And that's no doubt because it saves them a lot of energy and work building in the building of combs. Presence of combs in cavity. Yeah, what I did is I had old combs and I could put those in, I would cut out pieces of black, dark old comb and wedge them into one box in a pair of boxes. That's how I did that test. But now what I do lately is I don't like climbing up high in those trees. I've fallen off a ladder once trying to carry down one of these big hives, a deep hive body hive, while walking backwards down a ladder. And that's not a good thing to do. So what I do now is I don't put them high off the ground. I say, okay, I'm going to put out my bait hives in a way that's not optimal for the bees, but it's optimal for me. So I put them out at kind of at, I don't know, chest height or waist height. Here's an example of one where I just put it on top of an old hive in an apiary, an abandoned apiary that I found. And this isn't even a 10-frame hive body. It's a 6-frame nucleus box. And it's got a small entrance, and it's got a little wire to keep the mice out of it. And it's got some old frames of old comb in there, and it works really well. I get a swarm in this place almost every year. It's a really nice, it's a good setup, and it's very easy to collect. Not too heavy. And as I'm sure you all know, that if I don't collect it quickly and the bees fill up those 6 frames of comb with honey and brood, it can get pretty heavy. So you have to want to check them pretty frequently, which I'll talk about in a bit. So just to review, it's like, what do the real estate people say? Location, location, location. Well, here's just to review. Height, 10 feet up is ideal for attracting bees, but it's a little dangerous for the beekeepers. So I don't go quite that high these days, but that's good to know that the bees like it high up. The entrance direction, facing south, is preferable for the bees. Visibility, I make them highly visible because I think wherever I put them, whether it's high or low, I know that those scout bees are going all around in the woods. And if you can make that dark opening of your nest entrance face out into a clearing, I think it's easier for the scouts to find that nest box because they're looking for dark openings. I've seen them. I can't talk about this today, but I've done a lot of studies on an island off the coast of Maine where I've looked at how the scout bees behave, and they're really orienting to dark openings. I like to put the nest boxes in the shade, not out in the sun. And and I do this because I saw this experience a couple of times where a swarm would move into a nest box that was out in a sunny location. And evidently what happened is they moved in, the box got overheated, and then they moved out. And as you can see, they built their combs here. They probably would have been okay if they had combs already built in the box and they could spread themselves out, but they were probably hanging in this box as a mass of bees, and they overheated, so they moved out. So I try to put my boxes, bait hives, in shady places. And here's another thing. Distance from the apiary. You want to put your boxes, your bait hives out at least 100 yards. And the reason I say this is when I started doing this, I thought, I'm going to put some bait hives, close to an apiary because I know there's probably going to be a swarm or two coming from my hives, and I want them to have a handy bait hive. Well, I never, ever caught a swarm in a bait hive that was within 100 yards of an apiary. And I think it's because the nest site scouts know when they go searching that they really want to look for a home that's well away from their old home, just to disperse their new colony from the apiary, or at least from the old home. So at least 100 yards from an apiary. Should you put anything inside there? In my experience, the swarm lures, the commercial swarm lures, work very, very well. They contain the citral, the nasonov pheromone, and they're helpful. And I think they're helpful because they make your box easier for a nest site scouts to detect. They're not essential. I worked for years without them, but I do know that they increase the likelihood of your scout bees finding your box and then choosing it for the home. And I also, in this hive the hive design that I use now, I do put in frames of comb because I know that makes the box attractive for the bees, and it makes it very easy to transfer the bees to a real hive. You don't have a bunch of combs just attached to the walls of the bait hive, things like that. They move in, and it's a very clean setup. You might say, well, I don't have old combs to put in my bait hives. Could I put in frames with foundation? I'd have to say, it probably, maybe that works well, because especially if it's got some odor of beeswax to it, but I don't have much experience with that. I have the opportunity to use older combs. Okay, part 4. That was what we've looked at so far is how to make a bait hive and where to put it. What about inspecting the bait hives? Well, my advice in this regard is to check it frequently, because it's a lot easier to take down a recently occupied bait hive than one that's still, bees have been occupying for a few weeks and they might have it already stuffed with honey, or at least heavily loaded with honey. And I say that because I have done that, and as I say, it's dangerous. I've fallen off a ladder. It's not recommended. One thing I do guide you, though, to is that you might be wondering, how do I know? I see flight of bees around the entrance of my bait hive. How do I know if it's just scout bees or whether it's occupied? Well, fortunately, the bees give us a very handy indication. If you see bees coming in carrying loads of pollen, that means there is a colony established inside your bait hive. It's not just nest site scouts exploring. Nest site scouts don't carry pollen. Isn't it nice of the bees to do that for us? So that's about it. How to inspect the bait hives. Now, another part of how to use bait hives is taking down a bait hive. Well, okay, and we've touched on this, but it's good to review this because this is important. You can do it dangerously or you can do it safely. Well, first point, as you can see, have a smoker lit before placing the ladder against a tree if you're using a ladder. Climb the ladder, smoke the entrance, and staple a screen over the entrance. And make sure it's a screen that's not really fine, because those bees, if you've got a big colony of bees in there and you screen it off and we're working with small entrances, they can overheat. So I do it at night when it's cool, for sure, when most everybody's at home. Third point, use a rope. And this is something I've learned. I learned this by the hard way. Tie one end to secure the hive and the other end around a limb above and tied to the ladder. And it's really nice. So then you can climb down. And ideally, if you have a partner, the person at the bottom can be holding the rope while you're sliding the bait hive off the platform, or you're removing the nails that are holding it to the tree. So use a rope, remove the nails, lower bait hive to the ground, and then, of course, take it to your apiary. And you want to do it in the evening or early in the morning. Sometimes the morning's morning is, if you like to get up early, it works actually better. It's more safe because you're not working with the light diminishing. The light is getting stronger and stronger. But as you probably know, you got to get up early. You got to get up early to beat the foragers going out on a day of warm weather. Now, what I want to talk about now, let me talk a little bit now about the benefits of getting bees from wild colonies using bait hives. And this is something I wasn't aware of until rather recently when I did an experiment. And what I did is I made a comparison of colonies that were headed by queens produced by a California queen producer versus colonies that were headed by local queens. And when I say local queens, I mean these were queens that I caught in bait hives. The colonies moved into the bait hive. I put each colony in its own hive. But then for this experiment, I stole the colony's queen for the purposes of the experiment. So both the California queens, which arrived in the mail, and my local queens were both starting out in the same situation of being introduced to a small nucleus colony. So I established two groups of colonies, and for the experiment, you want to have everything the same except for except the source of the queens. So in this experiment, I established two groups of colonies, and the two groups of colonies were put in the same location. And each colony was started out as the same size colony with the same resources. It was started as a 2-frame nucleus colony in June 2019. And then I left all of these colonies. Each colony was left alone all summer. Then, at the end of the summer, in October 2019, I measured the mite level in each colony. And then in April 2020, following the winter, we assessed the winter survival of the colonies in both groups. So you can see it's a well-controlled experiment. Really, the only difference between these two, and the bees were left because they started out as small colonies, 2-frame nukes. I didn't super them up. They spent their whole summer just getting their nests established and getting their hives filled with honey, and that worked well. They didn't swarm, and by the end of fall, each colony had its nest, its hive, quite well stocked with honey. So but what did we see? What did I see? Well, here's a comparison of the mite levels in the colonies. The colonies headed by Oliveira's queens from California versus colonies headed by queens caught in bait hives in New York. And this is the units, or the standard units of mites per 300 bees. And I made these measurements using the sugar shake test at the end of the first summer, October 2019. And the Oliveira's queen colonies, well, these were the mite counts, mites per 300 bees, 17, 10, 4, 24, 9, 5, and 18. Now here are the counts for the bait colonies that were headed by bait hive queens from New York. 0, 3, 22, 4, 5, 1, 1, 1. Okay, that looks different, but what was really different was the survival patterns, what I found the next spring. Winter survival. Colonies were checked on 7th of April. The colonies with the Oliveira's queens, well, wherever you see a yellow and with a line through it, that colony was dead. And if you see a white number, that colony was alive. So of the Oliveira's queens, they almost all died. Only one survived, and it was the one that had the lowest mite count. Now, likewise, the bait hives, it was just the other way around. They all survived except for the one that had the high mite count. And so survival was 14%. Over here was 85%. And I want to stress that these colonies were set up at the same time. They started out with workers taken from colonies in the same apiary. The only thing that really differed between them was the source of the queens in the colonies of the two groups. And as you can see, there was a big difference in their survival. And I don't know where the queens that showed up in my bait hives came from. And I suspect this one where the mite levels got out of control, got very high, that might have been a swarm that came out of a beekeeper's hive headed by a queen from California. I don't know. But what I do know is that when I set up this experiment and I stocked my bait hives with wild-caught queens, I got good winter survival, low mite counts, and good winter survival. Whereas if I stocked them with Oliveira's queens from California, I got high mite counts and low winter survival. And I want to stress that these Oliveira's queens, they're the ones that the queen producer brags as having VSH traits. Well, I guess that might be but it's not enough. VSH trait by itself is not enough to control the mites. And we're still not entirely sure what all the traits are in these wild colonies that control the mites. But I had a student that looked at this, and he said that these bees, the wild colonies, they were distinguished not by the VSH trait, but by being really aggressive to biting the mites. So they were real mite biter bees. And so I think that's probably a more direct way for the bees to control the mites. But we don't have the full story. But what is clear is that the bees that I pull out of the wild, they know most of them know all about mites and how to control the mites. And because natural selection has been operating on them. The ones that don't survive a winter aren't going to make swarms, and thus they're not going to show up in your bait hives. And again, I do take the step of putting my bait hives as far as possible from the places where I know there are beekeepers' hives, because I know a lot of beekeepers buy their queens from places like Oliveira's. So the final considerations I want to say regarding using bait hives are these. First, the swarms that you catch are likely to consist of good, vigorous bees. Because why is that? Because weak colonies, as we all know, don't swarm. So you're catching a swarm. You're catching bees from a strong colony. It might not be resistant to Varroa, but it's gotten to the point, at least it's in that early spring part of the summer, it was a strong colony. I think it's a good way to increase the genetic diversity of your bees, especially if most of your bees are colonies are headed by queens you've bought from a commercial queen producer. And I have to say, I've obtained beautiful bees with bait hives. These, in other words, when I say beautiful bees, I don't just mean physical beauty. Well, in fact, I don't care at all about their physical beauty, but they're build up well. They're make a lot of honey. And they survive winters. And they're not ornery bees as a rule. Every once in a while, I get a really nasty colony, but generally, no. So I get beautiful bees with bait hives, and the capture success I've had year in, year out over goodness knows how many years I've been doing this. It varies from year to year. Sometimes it's like 90%. Sometimes it's like 20%. The average, I went through and calculated, is about 50%. 50% of the bait hives I put up in a year. So just to summarize, here are the rules for capturing swarms with bait hives. It's the right box in the right place at the right time.